What I did not realize embarking on testing out cruising on a sailing ship was just how many of my assumptions going in were wrong. After going on over 100 regular ocean cruises, I decided to try one out to experience what I assumed would be rather different facilities, daily program, dining, and a very different feeling sailing with sails rather than with regular cruise ship engines. Welcome aboard, I'm Gary Bembridge. Now I decided to do my sailing ship cruise with Windstar. I'd been on and liked their small 312 passenger regular cruise ships, and of course I knew they had 3 sailing ships. So I booked an 8-night Venice to Rome cruise on their 342 passenger flagship 5-mast Windstar. On boarding, I had my first assumption about regular cruise ships versus sailing ships blown apart. I expected a sailing ship to be as different on the inside because it looks so different on the outside to regular cruise ships. When I first saw Windstar on the boat transfer from the hotel to the Venice cruise port, it reinforced how unique it is compared to regular cruise ships. Sailing ships are, including the shape of the bow, it's very different. There are masts rising above the hull instead of deck on deck of cabins that you have on regular cruise ships. But once on board, it felt and looked surprisingly like regular cruise ships. And as the day unfolded, it operated similarly too. There were some obvious and quirky differences that I will come to. But first, what felt the same? The venues, for one. They were all the ones that I expect on regular cruise ships too. There were several bars and lounges. They had a Compass Rose bar, the lounge, and a pool bar. The lounge was laid out like a cabaret lounge where they did the shows and the port talks. There was a cafe, the yacht club. There was a fitness center and spa. There was a pool deck with hot tubs, a shop, and of course guest services, excursions, and future cruise desks. When it came to dining, like many regular cruise lines, they had a culinary partnership, theirs being the James Beard Foundation, with various James Beard award-winning chef dishes on all of the menus. Like regular cruise lines, there were choices of dining venues. There was the veranda buffet open for breakfast and lunch with indoor and outdoor seating. There was the Amphora main dining room, which was open for dinner with a generous menu of rather high quality and great dishes. It even had specialty dining. The veranda became waiter-served candle steak and seafood restaurant at night, and there was the French Stella Bistro. Of course, there was not as many choices of venues as on most regular cruise ships, which are larger and carry more people, but they had all the expected venues, which all looked like they could have easily been on those regular cruise ships too. They were missing a few venues that some regular cruise ships have, like, for example, a casino, a photo shop, an art gallery with auctions, kids clubs, and features like, say, rock climbing walls. But I've been on many regular cruise ships that don't have them either. Also, when it came to the daily program, while there weren't as many activities as on most regular cruise ships due to the number of guests and only having a cruise director and not a full entertainment team, it was basically the same set of activities. We had trivia, dance classes, cooking demonstration, a galley tour, captain's welcome and farewell events, captain's Q&A, port talks, excursion and future cruise sales talks. They also brought some local cultural entertainers on board when we were in Dubrovnik. There was live music around the ship from a saxophone player, a pianist, and a dance band trio in the different bars and lounges across the evening. And there were shows. They were nothing like on regular cruise ships though, and much lower key. In fact, it was either the cruise director performing themed song shows or from the onboard musicians. There were no guest entertainers, no production cast, and the cruise show was probably seen by many as the main entertainment highlight. What about some more standout differences that struck me about this sailing ship? Well, first, being on a sailing ship, due to the design, layout, and being smaller, I felt more connected to the sea than when on regular cruise ships. On regular cruise ships, especially newer ones, I sometimes almost forget that I'm actually at sea. The ships tend to be more internally focused, corralling us and focusing our attention inside rather than outside, with dramatic atriums, often with no windows out to the ocean, with bars, cafes, restaurants, and even theatres and casinos and shops all radiating off or connected to them. It's encouraging us to be in and actively inside, and of course in those revenue generating parts of the ship. On a sailing ship, the ocean is much more visible and much more accessible. You can see it from every venue. And because there's fewer activities versus regular cruise ships, I found people actually spend more time out on the decks watching the ocean, the coastline, and almost everyone came out on deck for the sail away when the sails came out. Another key difference is the smaller range of cabin choices. None of them had a balcony and all have portholes. So unlike regular cruise ships where balcony cabins are by far the main type of cabin. Unlike those ships, all cabins were actually below the promenade deck, down in the hull of the ship, because the masts and the sails, of course, are out on top. But even on a luxury sailing ship like Windstar, the cabins were smaller too, with the bathrooms being rather cozy. There was a downside I found with a sailing ship linked to the smaller size. Fewer venues and activities and cabins not ideal for hanging out. That was when the weather was less good, as I had at the beginning of my trip, where it was chilly, it was windy, it was raining. It felt kind of less vibrant and a bit dull versus the poor weather days on a regular cruise ship where there's so much more going on. Sailing ships I've found are best for warm, sunny weather. There were more dining spaces outside than inside in the veranda buffet for breakfast and lunch. The Compass Rose bar had more seats outside than inside, and so on. It is more about being outside, I think, enjoying the sailing and the scenery. Another difference to regular cruise ships was the open bridge policy. Other than during sail-in and sail-out, I could just pop into the bridge to talk to the team. On regular cruise ships, it's really hard to get to the bridge. Often it's reserved for invited guests, or you have to go on paid for behind-the-scene tours. The ship also had a water sports marina at the back that was opened when the ship was anchored off ports, which was rather fun. Also, something I never experienced on any regular cruise ships was the watertight doors in the cabin corridors were always closed during sail-in and sail-out, blocking passageways. So I frequently had to use very specific stairways to get to my little section of the passageway. And then there was one massive thing that did not live up to my expectations and was not nearly as different to regular cruise ships as I had expected. When I thought of sailing ships, I imagined unfurling of sails with the crew up and down the rigging, the ship bobbing up and down and moving very differently through the sea. But it was rather different. As we set sail at the beginning of the cruise down the canal in Venice past St. Mark's Square, I had the first inkling that sailing was not going to be what I thought it was. Instead of the sails unfurling, they kind of rolled out slowly and mechanically. It was not as dramatic as I thought, and there was no crew involved as such. It was clear we were sailing under power, and the sails clearly were playing no real role in our movement as we sailed down the canal. And over the course of the cruise, I discovered this was pretty much the case always. After visiting the bridge and from the captain's Q&A, I discovered that while in theory the ship could sail with just sails, they don't. They always sail under power to stick to the itinerary, and because the weather or the wind is often not right to use sails. So if there's too much wind, it could damage the sails. If it's too little, they offer little help at all. So for example, on the one sea day we had, the captain confirmed that the sails were out, but they were having no effect. They were more there for show. Is that, I guess, what we guests expected? Though it had been windy and in the right direction overnight, and they'd used the sails to reduce fuel usage. I discovered that the ship could sail around 10 knots under power, and when the wind is right, sails can increase the ship's speed by up to 5 knots, but they use the sails, mostly it sounded like, to reduce fuel usage. But the ceremony of putting the sails out when we sailed out of the port became part of my cruise routine, even though I knew we were really operating under power like regular cruise ships do too. Also, the way the ship moved felt to me the same as on regular cruise ships. And while people I spoke to unfamiliar with small ships felt that there was a lot of movement, I didn't find it any more than on smaller cruise ships that I have been on. That's probably because, like regular cruise ships, the Windstar also has stabilizers, so the motion was like what I was used to on regular cruise ships. It quickly came home to me that if I wanted to get a true sailing ship experience, it only really happens on what are called tall ships, so lines that I discarded and not considered, like Star Clippers and Sea Cloud, for example. Understanding that got me to thinking about the upsides of being on this type of sailing ship with only 342 passengers was bringing if it wasn't the sailing experience. Being on a sailing ship didn't have as many upsides as I'd expected versus regular cruise ships, to be honest. The two upsides touted are they have more interesting itineraries because they go to less called on towns and cities that even smaller regular cruise ships do not or cannot go to. This is because sailing ships can moor offshore and tender passengers in. They don't need docks, infrastructure, and even to go to ports that therefore have to be able to deal with and have things for hundreds or thousands of people to do. Second, even if they do have to go to similar places as regular cruise ships, in many of them they can dock in the heart of cities, or they can more just outside it and tender people in rather than being way out in working ports, which can be, say, up to an hour away. But both I've found are rather mixed in practice based on your itinerary. 4 out of the 6 ports on my Mediterranean itinerary were actually going to be tender ports. As I discovered, this made the risk of missing a port higher, because if there's a lot of wind or swell, they basically can't run the tender service. I saw that in 2 ports. In Dubrovnik, we were due to moor right by the historic old town, but it was too windy. Fortunately, as it was early in the season, there was a spare slot at the out-of-town port that we could dock at. Later in the peak season, that would have been unlikely and a missed port. In Sorrento, the swell was high and it became rather challenging using tenders. I watched them struggling to embark people on and off the tenders, and even occasionally the tenders crashing into the tender platform. A lot of people didn't find it at all comfortable getting to and from the Sorrento Marino. But also, even though I was on a small sailing ship, I found that if calling into places popular with other cruise ships or land-based tourists, the plus of being on a small ship can get wiped out once I was actually in port. For example, though we could dock in the heart of Venice, which even smaller regular cruise ships cannot, they have to dock out of Venice, it was rammed full, of course, with tourists once you explored. In Split, Croatia, there were 2 large ships in Costa and MSC, plus hordes of land-based tourists. So the whole town was heaving and busy. So I had to shuffle around like everybody else. This brings me to another issue that I've faced, and this was cost. Going on a sailing ship, I discovered, is rather costly. My trip cost as much as a suite on most regular cruise ships I've been on, or even an entry-level balcony cabin on many of the luxury lines. Of course, I realized I was paying a premium to have just 342 guests and a more unique ship. But for me, the compromise on the cabin versus what the money would buy on the regular cruise ships, I actually personally found more challenging. Now, my trip cost just over $1,000 cruise only per night for 2 people. This included special dining, soft drinks and coffees, but did not include add-on things like drinks, Wi-Fi and gratuities, and of course excursions, laundry. The cruise before this one was on a regular cruise ship, the 1,900 odd passenger Holland America Amsterdam. It actually cost me $1,000 cruise fare per night on that, but it got me a massive Neptune suite, lots of added perks like a special lounge, access, concierge and so on. So while I was struggling with value and what elements made it worthwhile since the sailing experience had been mixed, I spent time talking to people who clearly were loving and rating the experiences, giving them great value, to find out what was common with them versus me. The demographics of my fellow passengers was like many regular premium cruise lines I've been on, like Holland America, Princess and so on. It was a bit older, mostly couples and mostly people from North America. But most actually didn't see themselves as typical cruise people. They were very destination and not ship focused, and didn't really value a lot of what regular cruise ships and lines offer, like lots of choice, big shows, loads of activities. I saw this in how poorly attended, in fact, most daily program events were, other than the daily port talks and briefings, which were well attended. They also wanted to have a less cookie cutter, a more unique ship, and cruise with as few people as possible. I met a lot of people who loved river cruises, so they were used to being on ships with fewer than 200 people. They wanted to be out in port exploring as much as possible, and liked that a sailing ship itinerary had no or few sea days. We just had one on our trip. The ship was pretty much deserted all day while we're in port, because people like to be out on the tours or self-exploring for as long as they possibly could. This also meant they were way less bothered about the cabin than I was. It was not a place they spent time in, and they valued a more casual, laid-back, informal nature once on board, which included a very relaxed dress code, with only shorts really being a no-no for dinner. But as a lot of that also applies to Windstar's motor yachts that also carry around the same number of passengers, join me over in this video to find what that experience is like and the pros and cons versus the sailing ship experience. See you over there.